cauldron of boiling death. The Middle Ages were an era of shadows where the lines between punishment, spectacle, and sadistic cruelty blurred until they were one and the same. Faith and fear ruled men as much as sword and crown, and in this crucible of dread, new punishments were forged to strike terror into the hearts of those who defied the law, the church, or the will of the mighty. Among these punishments, few carried the visceral horror of the cauldron, an instrument of death by boiling, where flesh and bone were offered up to heat, steam, and the searing hiss of fat melting into water. This was no swift hanging, no instant blade of the executioner's axe, but a punishment chosen precisely for its duration. Death in the cauldron was slow. It was theatrical. It was agony turned into public performance. And it was a punishment that reeked of cruelty so profound that it haunted even hardened medieval spectators long after the screams had ceased. Boiling as execution was not unique to any one kingdom. It appeared sporadically across Europe, from the turbulent reign of Henry VIII in England to the blood-stained chronicles of the Holy Roman Empire, and whispered legends in France, Flanders, and even Russia. It was not a common sentence, for the very act demanded elaborate preparation. A scaffold had to be raised, an iron pot forged in immense size, water or oil or even molten substances poured in, a fire stoked beneath it, and the crowd summoned to bear witness. But when it was chosen, the message was clear. This was no ordinary crime. This was a sin or betrayal so great that only the slow cooking of human flesh would suffice as payment. One of the earliest accounts comes from England in the 16th century, when Henry VIII decreed boiling alive as punishment for poisoning. Poison, to the Tudor mind, was seen not merely as murder, but as a hidden, cowardly, and ungodly act, striking at the heart of trust itself. And so, the poisoner was punished not with the mercy of the rope, but with the cauldron. Chroniclers tell of condemned men dragged to Smithfield, chained, and lowered into bubbling oil or pitch while crowds pressed close, their faces lit by the leaping fire beneath. Some were cast into the boiling depths in an instant, plunging them into a searing death that lasted only a few desperate seconds. Others, however, were lowered slowly, torso, legs, arms, inch by inch, so that their shrieks could ring out over the marketplace. The sound of skin blistering and splitting, the stench of cooking flesh wafting over the spectators, became part of the spectacle. It was meant not merely to punish, but to engrave terror into the very soul of those who watched. Yet England was far from alone. In the chronicles of medieval Flanders, there are whispers of entire cauldrons filled not with water, but with molten lead or tar. Here the condemned were not merely boiled but scorched and consumed, their bodies transformed into bubbling carcasses within minutes. In Russia, under Ivan the Terrible's cruel reign, stories circulate of boiling cauldrons kept ready for traitors and rebels. Iron pots heated by roaring fires, where men were flung screaming, their flesh peeling like wax before the Tsar's gory satisfaction. These accounts blur history and horror, for many chroniclers struggled to separate the truth from rumor. Yet the fact remains. Boiling was a punishment known and feared. The cauldron itself was a weapon of psychological warfare. Imagine the condemned, dragged through the streets, hearing the crackle of wood already piled high, smelling the acrid smoke rising as the fire licked at the belly of the iron pot. Villagers would gather from miles around, parents bringing children to learn the lesson that crime and betrayal bore consequences more terrible than imagination could conjure. The victim, bound in chains or ropes, was forced to stand before the rising steam, knowing each passing moment drew them closer to a death they could neither hasten nor escape. Executioners were masters of torment, and they wielded the cauldron with theatrical precision. Some victims were stripped naked, their skins slick with sweat as the heat of the pot radiated even before they touched it. Others were dressed in rags that would quickly soak and cling to their blistering skin. The slow immersion was favored by many executioners, for it prolonged the agony and offered the crowd more time to savor the punishment. First the legs, plunged until the skin peeled away in strips. Then the torso, where boiling water seared the organs beneath. Finally the arms, the chest, the head disappearing beneath the bubbling surface as screams curdled into gurgles and silence. Sometimes the cauldron was filled not with water, but with wine, oil, or even milk, substances that clung to the skin and caused even greater suffering. Medieval imagination knew no limits when it came to cruelty. Witnesses described the air around such executions as suffocating, thick with smoke, steam, and the nauseating odor of human fat cooking. For those forced to stand close, the smell would cling to hair and clothes, following them home long after the fires were quenched. And yet, the crowds came willingly. The macabre fascination of seeing a body transformed by fire and water was irresistible to a people hardened by famine, plague, and war. Death was part of daily life, but executions, especially those as brutal as boiling, were spectacles, grim entertainments that mingled horror with a strange communal exhilaration. The cauldron also carried symbolism. It was a punishment that evoked visions of hell itself. The condemned writhing in a boiling pot mirrored the sermons of priests who warned of sinners bubbling in lakes of fire and brimstone. To watch a criminal suffer thus was to glimpse divine justice enacted on earth. The Church did not always condone such methods, yet it rarely spoke out strongly against them, for the lesson was useful. Fear God, fear sin, or face the cauldron's embrace. But what of those who survived the first moments, who lingered in the cauldron's agony longer than expected? Some reports speak of victims who flailed and screamed for minutes, their skins sloughing off in sheets, their eyes bursting from heat, until mercy finally came in the form of death. Others fainted from shock, only to revive as the water boiled around them, dragged into consciousness by pain itself. Executioners sometimes stirred the water with iron poles, pushing the bodies down when they tried to surface. In the eyes of the crowd, this was justice served with perfection. The sinner consumed utterly in a vat of fire and steam. Not all cauldrons were filled with liquid. Some accounts tell of dry pots, massive iron containers heated red-hot, into which the condemned were placed and roasted alive like meat in an oven. Their flesh hissed against the iron, their screams echoing inside the metal chamber until their throats burned out. Such punishments blurred the line between execution and torture, for death could take hours. The victim's agony was not only visible but audible, and the clamor of their torment haunted villages for generations. The psychological terror extended beyond the condemned. For those who watched, the image lingered in nightmares. Children who were brought to learn obedience, often left scarred, unable to eat for days after smelling the charred flesh. Merchants and peasants carried home the memory of screams, whispered in taverns and homes alike. The cauldron was more than execution. It was medieval theater, a performance of death designed to brand fear into the marrow of a society. Yet even in its cruelty, boiling was rare. Its rarity made it more powerful, for when the cauldron was prepared, the news spread like wildfire. To hear that the fire had been lit beneath the pot was to know that something dreadful had occurred, that a crime had shaken the order of things so deeply it required a death reserved for the damned. Villagers would abandon their fields, artisans their workshops, all to gather at the scaffold. For one day, the community was bound not by labor or faith, but by the shared spectacle of suffering. Time eroded many of these tales, yet the cauldron's horror lived on in whispered stories and medieval art. Woodcuts and manuscripts sometimes depicted men in giant pots, flames licking around them as demons stoked the fires. Artworks blurring execution with hell's eternal torments. These images reinforced the lesson. Earthly justice was but a shadow of the punishment awaiting the unrepentant. Even centuries later, the cauldron of boiling death retains its grotesque fascination. It embodies everything terrifying about the medieval era: the blending of faith and brutality, the theater of cruelty, and the unflinching gaze with which society turned human agony into public instruction. It was not the most common punishment, nor the most practical, but it was among the most haunting, a punishment that turned the condemned into both victim and spectacle. In the end, the cauldron stands as a symbol of mankind's capacity for darkness. It reminds us that in the medieval world, justice was often indistinguishable from cruelty, and mercy was a luxury rarely afforded. The screams that once rose from boiling pots have long since faded into silence, but their echoes linger in history's grim pages. The cauldron of boiling death was more than a punishment. It was a ritual of horror, a communion of fear, and a mirror held up to a society that could look upon suffering and call it justice.